Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for agreeing to jump into this recap conversation right after we finished our session of the question for episode 57. It was a really good conversation. We talked about so many things regarding the balance between rigidity and flexibility in design systems. And those of you who have worked on systems for a long time know that it is an age-old challenge, I think, as a community, we've been trying to tackle. And so it was really fun to bring that question to the larger systems community. We sent this question out to 900 design system practitioners. You can see in the FigJam here, we got 63 responses. Wherever you're watching this, you'll be able to kind of click and see the link to the raw data yourself. So you can take a peek at the way the community answered these questions. We asked four questions of the community. We asked about on a sliding scale from rigid to flexible, where would they position their system? We asked about whether that approach has worked for them and for their consuming teams. And then we asked for a little bit more clarity there, why or why not is that the case? And then finally, we just asked them to provide a little bit of insight in terms of like how their system is either rigid or flexible. And all of that data is anonymized and in that raw data file for you to take a peek at. I would love to take a moment to just sort of let you let the folks who are joining me here today introduce themselves, so you know who all you're talking to. So, Ismail, I'll start with you. Tell me a little bit about who you are, and then what your experience with systems, and then choose someone else to pass it to.
Yeah, so I'm a design system consultant. It's been like 5 years that I'm doing that, and as I was saying on the question, the path that led me to that field was just laziness, because I don't like to do the same thing two or three times. And yeah, last year I wrote a book about design tokens in French. And so I will let Steve talk about that, but we are reiterating the thing with much more deepness, with much more knowledge, with much more people. So yeah, I'll let Aurélien introduce himself.
Hello, my name is Aurélien, and I started making design system in 2016, just after reading a wonderful article from Audrey Hack, which with the French designer Pop about design system. And why design system is really interesting for me. This is because I deeply believe in the collaboration between designers and developers. Because I am both engineer and designer. I'm a consultant for different companies, and I'm also the UI color palette project founder, which is a color palette generator you can find on Figma and Penpot very soon. And I can
Nice.
let Steve introduce himself to continue the conversation.
All right. Hi, folks. Yeah, so I've been a design system engineer since 2017 now. Been working in a variety of contexts, and I've realized just how often I end up doing the same thing and finding the same solutions, and not necessarily on UI components, but workflows, tooling, automations. And well, I mean, I've been an avid user of Storybook for a long time. Now I'm involved in the project as a community advocate. I help out other developers and add-on authors, with maintaining the code and using Storybook. I run a few events, and I always love to highlight how other engineers have come up with creative solutions and integrated solutions for the problems that their organizations are facing. And I always love when engineers go a little bit out of their way to share their code, to share their thinking and their reasoning, because that's how we can end up finding that we're all doing kind of the same thing, and there's a tool space, there's a product space, and we can actually, share what we've been building, create open source products, things like Style Dictionary and Terrazzo, things like Storybook that we all use on a daily basis. So I'm always excited to hear from others on what they've been building, and that's why I try and highlight and showcase in the events that I run. We've all been like joined together here, Aurélien, Ismail, myself, and Nate Baldwin, who's a principal senior designer at Adobe. We've come together to work on that second edition of the book. That I think is an excellent educational resource on design tokens, and unfortunately, it's only available in French. And we want to take it a notch further and make it kind of a practical guide that goes into the, I would say, the practical details of building design tokens and using them and maintaining them, kind of like going through the entire day-to-day of a design system team that builds this tokens. And we want to cover both, a good kind of tried and tested recipe that we've come up with because we've worked in so many contexts, and also some of the advanced emerging topics where nobody's really sure what's going on, and then we can maybe provide a few pointers to help people, wrap their heads around these topics. So that's what brought us all together here.
Yeah. And in those conversations with that sort of second edition, we were chatting a little bit about this idea of culture and of rigidity and flexibility and how these things kind of interrelate. And we had the idea that perhaps we could bring that question to the larger systems community through the question as an avenue for that learning. So thank you all for agreeing to kind of come on board for an episode and sort of put that out there to the larger community. In that FigJam file, if you're watching the recap now, there's a bunch of areas where we spent a lot of interesting time digging in. Early on in the conversation, we talked just kind of briefly about some of the more quantitative like answers. So just a quick summary of that is that we did see kind of an average score on that flexibility scale of just a little bit past center towards flexible. So 2.78 is sort of the number there, which you can see about half of the folk kind of chose that just past center on the side of flexibility. And then it was a pretty even split between whether or not that was working for people. Yeses and nos, almost about 50% equally there. It was actually closer to like 50 and 40%. And then an interesting thing that we did see in the data, and again, this is not statistically significant, but it did kind of start to emerge that as people reported more flexibility in their systems, the rate of success that they reported also increased. So again, that's not a tried and true metric. In other words, don't say, if I just keep making it more and more flexible, I will be more and more successful. Of course, there's more nuance to it than that, but that was an interesting thing that we saw in that data. I also think we had a really good conversation around boundaries and started even drawing some diagrams together. Do you want to jump in to sort of like share something that you took away from this kind of conversation around a spectrum of like from rigidity to flexible? Where do we draw those lines? Anybody have thoughts there?
Yeah, so what I found fascinating was there were in all the data that we saw and in the conversation, there were areas of positive sentiment around rigidity. There are sometimes where if you decide to not provide freedom, there may be clear benefits. So accessibility came out, and this is truly an area where sometimes you can just be wrong. The people mentioned as well the necessity to produce high quality UIs in specific areas of a product. User research maybe has been conducted to show that something works better. A few people mentioned that maybe the consuming teams don't have the same experience or skill level to make the right decisions, so it's good to guide them. And at the same time, it's interesting to put that into perspective and to give visibility to the reasoning that we've applied, right? To show why we've decided to go with rigidity or what benefits we expect are provided. And it's even better if we can highlight and show the assumptions that we've made about our consumers and their context of use, so that they're equipped to both make the right decision and choose whether or not they need to follow the rigid prescriptive way, and also so that they benefit and they learn from the work that has been done to produce a component.
Yeah, I found it really interesting in the conversation that I think it's easy when we're using words like rigid and flexible. I think it's easy to kind of bring your own baggage to those definitions, right? And so I do think it's a tendency for folks to say, "Oh, flexible is good, rigid is bad." But you're really accurate, Steve, when you mentioned that there were that wasn't a part of this conversation. Like people did not come to this with that concept that being rigid is bad. I think they came to it with the idea that there's a lot more nuance to it, and we just need to be intentional when we choose to enforce or put more rigidity around things, and intentional when we offer more flexibility. And along those same lines, one of the things that we talked about was the cost of flexibility, right? Like, so that's something that really stood out to me is like, if you're going to be flexible, that comes with a whole lot that you have to manage. Was that a key sort of recognition for anyone else or?
Yeah, the cost of the flexibility, I really joined the subject to the trust. At a point, do you trust your teammates? And do you trust them to build the right things out of the tools that you give them? So I found that really interesting. And at a point, the trade-off that you have to do with flexibility and rigidity. If you're too flexible, the cost will blow off. And if you're super rigid, people will get super frustrated. Maybe you'll go really faster, but people will get super frustrated, and then there will be other costs in the company.
Yeah, I think this is truly an area where you can design it in advance and get away with it, or you can just let it happen and it can blow out of control. So like Christine pointed out, if you plan for scalability, if you plan for composability right from the start, then people can come up with the patterns that work for them. But those patterns that emerge, those different compositions of components and tokens, they don't generate maintenance costs for you. But if you end up with a system that requires you to intervene to provide more flexibility to a new team or a new use case, and then you just pile on new variants and new props, you end up at a point where you have hundreds of permutations of a component to manage, and you no longer can keep it stable and functional.
The kinds of costs are a little bit different probably in each org, but certainly with more to maintain, more variation sort of enabled, that it comes with just a lot of oversight, a lot of like consideration. So that's definitely something to take into consideration there. Ismail, I'm going to call you out on this one too, because you said something in the chat that I thought was really interesting. You kind of started talking about how you believe the design system team shouldn't be building the components for the consumers. And I think a lot of people were kind of like, wait a second, isn't that our job? So can you try to like just expand that a little bit? Like give me a little bit of like what led you to say that?
Yeah, my idea behind that is that at a point when you're in the design system team, you don't really understand the final user need. You don't work on the final user journey and the features that you'll get to them. So that's why I really think that we can help people, we can help designers, product teams, developers work on their components, but I'm not sure that if we build the components for them, it will be the most effective ones, and that it will have other costs at a point that you will need to rework on them, reiterate on them, and not on a clever way. So I feel that design system teams should work more on a collaboration way with the product teams than just giving them some solutions without having any knowledge of the context and on the user needs.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting observation that we are removed from the end user in some ways. And so to imagine that we could build things that would be directly used by consuming teams to create an interface with those users that we don't have actual, connection with is actually, yeah, that's probably risky. So um, I think that's a really interesting take on this, and I do think it challenges what a lot of teams think of when they imagine their role as a systems team. So I think it's a great sort of hot take for us to consider. Any other thoughts on that from the rest of y'all?
Yeah, I did want to say this is something that has always surprised me initially, right? Whenever I joined a new org and I started working on a new design system, I always felt, well, yeah, I mean, clearly we need to put together, the common ground, and we need to enshrine it, especially because we're doing so much with so few resources. It's important to focus where we have the largest impact, right, and the widest audience. And I think now with hindsight, that there are a few tools at our disposal that can help us deal with that kind of dilemma that we have. One of them is tiered design systems, so we can choose to provide more centralized components that are less opinionated, that are applicable to a wider range of use cases, or components that have a particular level of complexity where it really makes sense that we show the better way of a more user research informed way to do things. And at the same time, we can give teams the entire tool set that they need to build their own tokens and components and the autonomy to make the right decisions for themselves. And I think another tool at our disposal that is interesting here is to actually measure which components are used and which properties and variants of a component are not used, right? To understand when the landscape has shifted, when the users are different, when they have different experiences or different needs, and then when something is no longer the common recurring pattern that we thought it was at some point.
Yeah, I think that's great. That sort of nuance of like what to track is something a lot of teams are struggling to figure out, you know. So I think that idea of variation as a signal in some ways, you know, and that actually gets at something else that you said just after the session ended, Steve, which was the idea that in past experiences, you've had situations where you know the consuming teams were coming to you asking for a lot more flexibility, and you kind of observed that that was honestly many times a signal that the components or whatever assets you were offering just weren't actually meeting their needs, and their default response was, we'll make it more flexible, but in reality it wasn't flexibility, it was just the wrong solution. Is that something you could say a little bit about here?
Yeah. So we had teams that were used to having a lot of autonomy, and they would happily relinquish control and ask us to be more rigid and more opinionated on a lot of things because they trusted us. But there were specific components where they asked for more flexibility and where they asked for change on a very regular basis. And that's what was striking to me. When we examined these components, we noticed that they were too bloated, they had too many variants, they were trying to do too many different things at the same time, or they were buggy, and it was just difficult to get something done with them, right? But when we reworked the components, sometimes making several more rigid but distinct and clearer components, sometimes by applying a better form of flexibility, by applying composition patterns, then those problems vanished. And I think we can make a parallel with a non-metric in software engineering. When you have a piece of code somewhere in your architecture that keeps changing, that keeps receiving attention, it's usually a sign that it's poorly designed and poorly architectured, and that it needs to be reworked from a broader perspective.
Yeah, that's a great analogy, actually. I love that. The last thing that really stood out to me in this conversation was I think something that Tony Ann mentioned in the call, where she was talking about the position of the system in the eyes of the rest of the organization. Like, how does the org see the system team? And I thought that was just such a really sharp insight. In other words, meaning like if the org values you as a leader, then perhaps you can sort of get away with the rigidity because it is a matter of saying, hey, our role is to establish the standard. Versus when the organization sees you as just sort of helping them be a little bit more efficient, your job is kind of flipped on its head, and it's more about just cataloging what is being used in product. And those are very different roles, you know. I don't know if I did you all pick up on that conversation as well? Was that something meaningful or?
Yeah, it's a brilliant insight, and it does define so much of a conversation here. If you are seen as an expert by your own consumers, not only the role that the organization wants you to have, but if you are seen as an expert, then people will come to you with UI and interaction design problems, and they will want you to provide a solution, and they'll sacrifice some degree of control. Uh, but if you are in an organization where people value their autonomy, or where people feel that others don't really understand them, or that they have a much better understanding of the end user, and they need to keep control of how things need to happen closer to them, then indeed you need to provide infrastructure and tooling and processes to make them craft faster or make them craft more coherently within their own subset of domain knowledge.
Yeah, it's always fun to bring these kinds of very sort of strategic and high level conversations to the community because people are bringing their tactical daily work to these higher level conversations, and that really it really gives you such a good perspective. So I just want to thank you all again for taking some time out of your day to one, join the question, two, jump on this sort of last minute recap with me and share a little bit about what you took away from the session. It means a lot to me. Thank you so much. And I will look forward to reading the second edition of the book that you all are putting out in English. I can't wait. So thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Ben. It was a
Thanks,
pleasure.
man.